Remember a few weeks back when I talked about how the common skeptic saying the plural of anecdote isn't evidence or isn't data is actually wrong? Well, let's talk a little bit more about that. A large number of things humanity now scientifically knows come from anecdotal data that scientists then follow up on. Like scurvy, for instance. Back in the 18th century, doctors thought that scurvy was caused by ill-digested and putrefying food within the body, which, fun note, is also what alternative health proponents think is the cause of all disease, which is why they're constantly blasting their assholes with coffee and whatnot. But even though there's no way for people back then to have known how or why this worked, they did notice that eating citrus seemed to make scurvy better. James Lind conducted what may have been one of the first clinical trials when he gave seamen, let's go with sailors, oranges and lemons and apple cider, and found that they got better from their scurvy, especially compared to these other sailors who he gave vinegar and barley water and, oh Lord, these poor men, half a pint of seawater. Many experts, though, continued to dismiss Lind's study as anecdotal data, because really, why would some fruit help with food that was putrefying in your intestines? But the Navy said fuck it, and despite not knowing shit about vitamin C, they started giving rations of citrus to sailors, which then stopped dying of scurvy. Eventually, more research was done, and doctors figured out what was actually causing scurvy and why citrus prevented and cured it. Okay, so why am I talking about all of this? Because of LSD, obviously. Because over the past few years, there have been more and more studies looking into the benefits of microdosing LSD. Because for much, much longer now, hippies and burnouts and, entire populations of indigenous people have been saying, hey, I took this drug and it was wild. My dog changed color and spoke to me. But when I sobered up, I actually felt way better about my life. I felt less anxious or less depressed or just more connected to the greater fabric of the universe in a way that gave me peace of mind. So of course, curious scientists would want to know a few things like, is this really happening? If it is, how big of an effect is it? How much can we attribute to the drug compared to the ceremony and the excitement surrounding the drug? What side effects are there? How long does the effect last? And how does this compare to the other interventions we have, like SSRIs or physical exercise or psychotherapy? Oh, and of course, drug companies would really love to fund this kind of research because, hot damn, if there's people taking a cheap or free or illegal thing and getting benefits from it, then wouldn't it be great if we could legally mass produce it and sell it back to them? Of course. Sorry, that's just often how your science gets made. Can billionaires make a shit ton of money off of this? Great. Or can militaries use this to kill people better? Bam, research grant. But we don't have answers to any of those questions yet because we only have anecdotes. We have sailors who say they felt better after they drank some grog with some orange slices in it because they're fancy. But we don't know if it was the grog or the orange or the sailor's own humors or something else entirely. So we need to study it. But the problem is that our society has determined that psychoactive substances like LSD are evil. And so not only can we not let random adults enjoy them on their own time, but we also need to restrict the way that scientists study how these substances interact with the human body. Because if we really wanted to see if LSD helps alleviate, say, depression, then a simple way to find out would be to get a bunch of depressed people who aren't currently using any drugs, legal or otherwise. You give them some tabs of LSD. You give other people plain pieces of paper with a My Little Pony character on it. You you really want them to think that they're taking LSD, and everyone knows all the best LSD has cartoon characters on them. Maybe you give another group talk therapy, and then you figure out how depressed all of these people are after 2 days, after 2 weeks, after 2 months, after 2 years. Boom. Now you have a pretty good idea whether or not LSD helps depression, how long it lasts, whether it helps more than licking pictures of Pinkie Pie, and whether it helps more than talking to a therapist. But scientists can't do that. It would be unethical because humans are illogical. Some small studies have been able to be done, but there's just so much red tape that they have to deal with. And even the cost to get the drugs is completely prohibitive. So nothing has been done on a scale large enough to give us much to work with. So instead, we're left with observational studies, which again, aren't completely useless. They can be very good in cases where we can't, for instance, do clinical trials because we might end up killing a bunch of sailors by making them drink seawater, just to name a random thing. And the observational studies for LSD have been very positive for the drug. Like in 2019, Australian scientists published a study in which they observed 98 people who already microdosed LSD and asked them to chart their feelings for 6 weeks. These people reported feeling less depressed, less distracted on days that they microdosed, but the effects didn't seem to last for very long afterward. They also tended to get a bit more neurotic on days that they microdosed. So that's basically one step better than a single anecdote. It's a lot of anecdotes. It doesn't tell us the whole story, but it does tell us, okay, it does appear that something is happening here. The scientists followed that up by asking a bunch of microdosers what they thought microdosing was good for. And the subjects reported vast, far-ranging effects beyond anything microdosing actually does for you. But interestingly, there seemed to be no correlation between the things that they thought microdosing was good for and what their study actually showed that it might be good for. So that gives us a hint that this might not just be the placebo effect. It's doing things that people don't expect it to do. There have been several other studies like that, many of which provided more and more evidence that there is something to the idea that low-dose psychedelics can help with a variety of psychological issues, but mostly depression. Endeavors like the Beckley-Moss Street Psychedelic Program and the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London were created to dig more deeply into this matter, including looking at brain scans, for instance, to determine how positive iterations of ego death, which is a common result of psychedelics that is described as losing your sense of self, your individuality, might lead to therapeutic outcomes. Those two programs I mentioned, Beckley and Imperial, have teamed up to attempt to do one of the first large-scale placebo-controlled blinded studies on microdosing, which finally, they published this paper, their first paper from the effort this week. How do you get a blinded, placebo-controlled study on a large-scale basis when you can't actually give subjects the drug in question? Well, it's pretty clever, actually. They recruited 191 people who already microdose, and they guided them through the process of creating their own identical placebo to match the LSD. The subjects then placed the real LSD and the placebo into envelopes marked with QR codes that were noted by the scientists. So the scientists knew which was in which envelope. They then mixed up the envelopes, picked one, and took what was inside. Exciting. It's like Russian roulette, but fun instead of depressing. Thanks to the QR code, the researchers knew whether the subjects were taking the placebo or the LSD. So over the course of the next 4 weeks, they tracked the psychological well-being of the subjects. And what they found was just what the observational studies predicted. Those who took the LSD enjoyed significant improvements in a broad range of psychological effects, like well-being, mindfulness, life satisfaction, and a decrease in paranoia, which, is probably why so many microdosers were comfortable telling strangers about their illegal drug use. Less paranoia. However, you knew there's probably a however, didn't you? They also found that the subjects who took the placebo, but who thought that they were taking the LSD, enjoyed almost exactly the same benefits. Damn you, placebo effect. Interestingly, those who took the LSD but thought it was the placebo didn't benefit nearly as much. The people who did the worst were the people who took the placebo and knew they were taking the placebo. Because that was part of the problem here. The scientists didn't tell anyone, whether or not they were taking the placebo. These subjects were already frequent microdosers. They were asked to guess if they took the microdose or the placebo, and 72% of them guessed correctly. That's much better than a random guess would be. That's going to throw off the results, which is why the researchers separated took a placebo and knew it from took a placebo and didn't know it. So it's kind of tough to say from this study that placebos worked just as well as microdoses. If the subjects didn't actually know they were taking a placebo, then of course it was just as good as the microdose. Because if you think about it, that's a completely circular argument and kind of a meaningless statement. If the subject takes a placebo and feels just as good as they feel when they take the microdose, then they think they took the microdose, and therefore the placebo is to them just as good as the microdose. If they take the placebo and nothing happens, they say, oh, this is a placebo, so it's not going to be as good as the microdose. The researchers point out this problem, along with the not insignificant problem of not being able to control for what drugs the subjects were actually taking. Like, they didn't evaluate the chemical makeup of the subject's drug or the amount and intensity of that drug. It was just, oh, you've microdosed before? Great. Whatever you manage to dig up on the streets, put it in this envelope and let's do a study. So yes, the conclusion of this study was that they were unable to distinguish the positive effects of microdosing LSD from placebo. But the real conclusion is, Jesus Christ, can we please just treat adult humans like adult humans and let them study this shit properly? I'm not saying we should remove all ethical restrictions, but as Professor David Nutt, former government advisor on drugs and currently affiliated with the Imperial program, says, stop classifying LSD the same way we classify things like heroin. It's not nearly as dangerous, and there is evidence of a possible medical use for it. And yes, Nutt was fired from his government position for saying as much. And yes, it was very funny at the time when all of the headlines were saying Nutt sacked. That was very funny, but also very pathetic that a country would fire someone who was just stating the current scientific consensus, which is what he was hired to do in the first place. The good news is that these studies are growing in number, and pressure is building on countries like the US and the UK to relax restrictions so that we can finally get to the bottom of whether or not tripping balls will make us happier.